Hi, I'd like to welcome you to my project today, where we're going to be looking at the archetypal hero's journey by relating marginalized literature to high school seniors through Orhan Pamuk's The White Castle. And so, our goals for today that we're going to consider are as follows. First of all, we're going to look at and explain the backgrounds of archetypes in literature and what that actually means. Secondly, we'll look at and introduce the concept of what are called archetypal journeys. From there, we'll discuss examples of a specific archetypal journey, as well as investigate how all of us are influenced by archetypal journeys. From there, we'll watch an informative YouTube video, a short video concerning the archetypal hero's journey, and then apply those skills that we learned from the YouTube video to an actual piece of marginalized literature called The White Castle. And we'll close by contrasting how a typical archetypal hero's journey is a little bit different when it comes to marginalized literature. So, without further ado, let us begin first by looking at what exactly an archetype is. You see this fine picture of this man. His name is Carl Jung. He was a classical psychologist, and he used this term archetype as someone who holds that behind each individual's unconscious, the blocked off residue of the past that lies, the collective unconscious of the human race that's expressed in myths, religion, dreams, fantasies, and for us today, literature. And what that actually means is that the archetypal critic will study a work in terms of the images or the patterns it has in common with other works, and thus as a portion of the total human experience, according to Harman's Handbook to Literature. So by taking that idea pronounced by psychologist Carl Jung in the early 1900s, we're better able to see literary criticism looked at from an archetypal perspective. David Lee says in an article that he has published in 2011 that archetypal literary criticism moves in several directions at once, from a textual perspective, an intertextual perspective, and a psychological perspective. So let's talk about what each of those archetypal criticisms mean. First of all, if you look at a text, you're going to look at it from a plot perspective, by a character perspective, the imagery perspective, the setting. And when you look at all four of those aspects of a text or a story, a book, you might see some archetypes that go across cultures and across time. You might also see some intertextual similarities, specifically when we look at all different cultures of world literature. Additionally, we can look at things from an archetypal perspective psychologically, where we look at the characterization and how directly and indirectly our characters develop, as well as the actual conflicts, both external, but more importantly, the internal conflict. And that's what we're going to see in our book today. Archetypal criticism of literature became most widespread among literary critics through the work of Northrop Frye, who studied literature at Oxford University in the late 1930s, where he was actually tutored by C.S. Lewis, the author of the Chronicles of Narnia series. He considered C.S. Lewis to be the best lecturer at the university at the time. So you can actually see a picture there of Northrop Frye. So when we approach the idea of archetypal literary criticism, we can also see it from the perspective of a man named Joseph Campbell, who in 1949 published a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And he popularized what is called the mythic quest pattern. And as you can see in the photo here, that mythic quest pattern has become known as the hero's journey. It's also known collectively as the monomyth. And what he means by that is that many different myths, many different stories, all types of myths, all sorts of cultures across the world tend to have the same basic hero's journey within its characters. So what exactly are some examples of archetypal journeys? There are a big three that I like to refer to them as. The first one is called the quest. The second one's called the hero's journey. And the third one's called man's moral peril. The quest is that basic idea of trying to obtain something, whether that's one's identity, as we're going to see also in The White Castle, but we can also see the hero's journey, not only the hero's journey as far as the main character making a journey somehow, but also sometimes that journey has to do with their own redemption. And we see that in a type of archetypal journey called man's moral parable, where they're trying to redeem themselves from something that they have done wrong. So when we blend all of these three different archetypal journeys together, the quest, the hero's journey, and man's moral parable, we have a great example of this that comes to life with the White Castle. We're going to specifically look, though, at the hero's journey aspect of it. Now, considering that in this picture, you see a photograph of an isolated, lonely road out in the middle of the desert, it looks like. And so I want to be sure that you realize that each and every one of you has a story to tell. And because of that, we have all been on a journey that we call life. And that journey is a part of that story that we can share. Unfortunately, though, especially when it comes to some of you, some people aren't able to tell their stories because of language barriers, because of social classism in the society, because of their immigrant status, because of past trauma or wars in their countries of origin. And unfortunately, sometimes those stories that we all have are stopped by death. And so as we look at Hero's Journey today, we're going to hopefully make that connection that you too can be the hero of your own story.
What is the hero's journey? Think of it as a cycle. The journey begins and ends in the hero's ordinary world, but the quest passes through an unfamiliar, special world. Along the way, there are some key events. Status quo, that's where we start. 1 o'clock, call to adventure. The hero receives a mysterious message, an invitation, a challenge. 2 o'clock, assistance. The hero needs some help, probably from someone older, wiser. 3 o'clock, departure. The hero crosses the threshold from his normal, safe home and enters the special world and adventure. We're not in Kansas anymore. 4 o'clock, trials. Being a hero is hard work. Our hero solves a riddle, slays a monster, escapes from a trap. 5 o'clock, approach. It's time to face the biggest ordeal, the hero's worst fear. 6 o'clock, crisis. This is the hero's darkest hour. He faces death and possibly even dies, only to be reborn. 7 o'clock, treasure. As a result, the hero claims some treasure, special recognition, power. 8 o'clock, result. This can vary between stories. Do the monsters bow down before the hero, or do they chase him as he flees from the special world? 9 o'clock, return. After all that adventure, the hero returns to his ordinary world. 10 o'clock, new life. This quest has changed the hero. He has outgrown his old life. 11 o'clock, resolution. All the tangled plot lines get straightened out. 12 o'clock, status quo, but upgraded to a new level. Nothing is quite the same once you're a hero. Many popular books and movies follow this ancient formula pretty closely.
So we're going to apply the book to the chart. So here we go. First, at 12, it starts with what is called the status quo. In this particular book, the voyage that the book is based upon is an ocean voyage in the ordinary world of the narrator. Evidently, the narrator's ships have imprisoned Turks and Moors. In this case, Pamuk specifically says, many men believe that no life is determined in advance, that all stories are essentially a chain of coincidences. And yet, even those who believe this come to the conclusion, when they look back, that they once took for chance were really inevitable. And so when we look at the status quo, we're realizing that our narrator is just okay with what's happening. But then when we move to 1 o'clock, it officially has what is called a call to adventure. Evidently, the ships had been on their way home, but then a Turkish fleet attacks them and takes our Venetian narrator captive. In the process, he then has his own call to action as they take him to Istanbul, Turkey, where they had actually come from. Along the way, he successfully impersonates a doctor. He has rather rudimentary skills and equipment. And he ends up learning the Turkish language incredibly fast. And so as a result of that, he gains some favor initially from the Pasha, the king, if you will, of their society in Turkey. And while he is in jail, he refuses to convert to Islam. He himself, from Venice, Italy, was a Christian. And so he will not convert. And that becomes a good part, a good aspect of the book that we'll focus on. So once we have that call to action, you see here in the top left, you see a round circle. That is where Venice would be. And then you see marked by the red arrow, you see where Istanbul is. In order to kind of picture the book, you'll have to realize that he would probably have been out here in the Mediterranean Sea, possibly in the Aegean Sea, between Greece and Istanbul. And then that's when they were taken through a small area from the Aegean Sea that gets them to Istanbul, which is on the edge of the Black Sea. Once he is taken to Istanbul, he is offered assistance at the 2 o'clock spot, if you will. It says, still in the ordinary world, that chapter 2 introduces us to the character of Hoja. Hoja is a Turkish religious official who is put in charge of the narrator as a captain. The Hoja is the classical archetype of an older leader full of wisdom. You see this in Lord of the Rings with Gandalf, etc. But the Hoja here, interestingly enough, isn't necessarily as classical as Campbell would like to bring it to life. It says, however, they're so similar in age and appearance, except that the Hoja has a beard. And so that similarity definitely develops the storyline as it keeps going. The narrator's training under the Hoja was more of an attempt to make him convert religiously. And so that assistance idea is brought to life even more so because the narrator is then moved from jail into the Hoja's actual home in order to help him serve as an apprentice, if you will. Okay, but then there is a departure at the 3 o'clock spot. The Venetian narrator must start leaving his old ways behind as he realizes that he is in this new special world, and as not an immigrant, but as a captive, he's probably not going to be able to get back to his old world. So he endures lots of adjustments living in Turkish society, which is predominantly Muslim in the book. And so he definitely has to make that transition. As a result of that, just one example is that he introduces a table into the Hoja's home rather than having a low table. He introduces a higher, more European type of table. He then helps the Hoja develop a fireworks display, and when he does this for the Pasha, the king, emotionally he's taken back home to Venice, and he starts getting homesick. So he departs from that old world, and then the trials start at the 4 o'clock spot. A series of trials takes the Venetian deeper into his new world in the land of the Turks. He still refuses to convert to Islam, and therefore he loses some favor with the Pasha. As a result of that, he officially becomes the Hoja's slave, definitely a trial. But as a slave, he begins teaching/learning along with the Hoja. And Pamuk says on page 32 that we were going to search together, discover together, progress together, both the Hoja and the Venetian. So the narrator, unfortunately, also has to endure a series of beatings, physical abuse from the Hoja in that process. And then the narrator starts the approach step at the 5 o'clock spot. He tries to regain his composure. He starts developing technology along with the Hoja, building clock parks, learning astronomy. They even write together. And the Venetian is able to approach the darkness of the Hoja and therefore Pasha again. Both protagonists essentially become one mentally in their pursuits of science, astronomy, astrology, zoology, and ironically, the militarization of the Ottoman Empire as well. Crisis starts at the 6 o'clock spot. An epidemic ravages through Istanbul. And so those of us who have been in quarantine the last 2 years, this definitely is an aspect of the book that we can relate to as being isolated from people. And so the Hoja and the narrator end up being isolated as well. As a result of that, they end up talking a whole lot. And as an indiscretion, as Pamuk calls it, the narrator shares dreams of his Venetian past with Hoja, and shares those dreams and shows that he's homesick. So as the Hoja focuses on his weapon for the Pasha, he's developing a weapon of mass destruction. The narrator starts realizing that the Hoja is perhaps a weapon being used against him. Rather than an actual external weapon, it's actually a person being used against him. So the crisis continues with additional beatings from the Hoja. As a result, a loss of self ensues with a scene in the book where the Hoja forces the narrator to approach a mirror alongside him. And it's as if they become one as they look in the mirror. Not only do they look similar, not only have they been writing together and doing all this work together, they're also basically blending together and becoming one as a person. They're so similar to one another. So definitely a crisis both externally as well as internally. But as a result of that crisis at the 7 o'clock spot, there's somewhat of a treasure within the narrator. The Venetian begins to see himself in the mirror, not just the Hoja, not just him in his old life. He begins to find who he really is as an immigrant or as a prisoner of war in reality. Pamuk says on page 66 that just as a person could view his external self in the mirror, he should be able to observe the interior of his mind and his thoughts. And so we get into the inner workings of the narrator's brain, just like we do in real life. We think so much, and Pamuk takes us into that as a character, how sometimes we can get lost in those thoughts, but at the same time, we can also find ourselves within those thoughts. Eventually, the Venetian finds ultimate favor with the Pasha because it's almost as if the narrator is able to trade places with the Hoja, because the Pasha declares that the intellectualism that the Hoja is coming up with is actually coming from the narrator. So as they mesh together, the Pasha is able to foresee this. And so he starts seeing the Venetian as a true treasure rather than just as a slave prisoner of war. So what is the result? Well, the result at the 8 o'clock spot shows, according to Pamuk on page 103 of the White Castle, that sometimes that he thought the Hoja treated him with contempt because he sensed that he had no country or no purpose. So here we have that idea of the plight of those who are marginalized, who are held in slavery and captivity, being mistreated as a result of that. And he starts thinking as well, because he calls it on page 107 that the river of history was pushing him backwards. He's constantly thinking about his past and dreaming of home and wanting to go back, but at the same time trying to assimilate into his new culture. Pamuk continues on page 117 by saying that in the process of finding himself, even though he was looking backwards, that he discovered that life was to be enjoyed rather than merely be endured. So as a result of that, he tries to make the best of his situation, as most people who go through difficult situations will do. Unfortunately, the Hoja is more set on escaping the fools, including the Pasha, and who he calls them, the others, within his own countrymen. And so we start seeing this weird dichotomy between the narrator and the Hoja, as the narrator starts sort of liking it in Istanbul. The Hoja is beginning to detest it more and more. So as a result of that, the Hoja finally ends up building a new weapon, and the Turks, under the Pasha's leadership, decide to basically try to conquer Europe in the process. And they face many others along the way, many different European countries in the Eastern European area. And so that's the result aspect. Then at the 9 o'clock spot, there is a return. After the attack of the White Castle of the book's title, the Hoja and the Venetian exchange clothes, and it seems to be that they also exchange lives, according to Pamuk on page 145. Interestingly enough, the Venetian ends up returning to Istanbul in the Hoja's place. The Hoja, on the other hand, depending on one's interpretation, might actually have gone to Venice in place of the Venetian. Along the way, Pamuk says on page 144 that he was looking to that new life at the 10 spot. He was waiting for morning, thinking of his new life without much enthusiasm, though. He really wasn't looking forward to it in this case, because was it a new life for him or was it not? Did he return to Venice for himself, or was it truly the Hoja who went? And that's part of that deeper interpretation that is up to you as a reader when you read it. As long as you're seeing that it's a part of this hero's journey, you'll be able to interpret the book a little bit better using that concept. As a result of the new life, the resolution of the story at the 11 o'clock spot says, Pamuk says on page 155 that to search within, to think so long and hard about our own selves would only make us unhappy. This is what had happened to the characters in my story. So the narrator takes upon the persona of becoming the writer of this actual book. And he says, for this reason, heroes could never tolerate being themselves. For this reason, they always wanted to be someone else. And so it's kind of an interesting twist here, a metafiction type of idea that we've read in some of our other works, where we have to question, did the narrator switch places with the Hoja, or did he not? And so that this particular quotation does show that within the resolution, there's some open interpretation for us to have to come to our own resolution as far as the story is concerned. And then back at the 12th spot, we return to a status quo. And unfortunately, in this case, more than likely, the hero's journey did not allow the Venetian to actually return home. And such is the case with many pieces of marginalized literature, where we have migrants who never truly have a home. We have immigrants who never fully get back home. Those who end up in exile and never get to go back home. And other marginalized people groups. It's unfortunately the status quo that many have to face in this world. And so Pamuk brings that to life in this particular book. Most of the time, the journey ends up being a person's attempt to find oneself in the midst of their new world. And that's definitely the case for the narrator, finding himself in the midst of his new world of Istanbul and the Ottoman Empire. The interesting aspect that I'd like you to take away from this is it's through this movement from a comfort zone of self into a place of the other that the characters in the book and you yourself truly will discover your true self. Sometimes we have to get out of that comfort zone in order for us to discover who we really are when the pressures apply. And that's definitely the case that the narrator faced in the book. So that being said, we have taken The White Castle by Orhan Pamuk and we've connected it to the different stages of Campbell's hero's journey, back from an ordinary world to a special world, back to an ordinary world. But our question is, does it fully relate? And I would dare say that it doesn't fully complete the cycle that Campbell has seen in ancient myths and in ancient stories. And it's because of that marginalized aspect of our narrator as well as the Hoja. But it is a good way to look at that overall picture. So today in this particular lesson, we have looked at the background of archetypes in literature, where they have come from. We've looked at the concept and some examples of archetypal journeys. We've discovered that each and every one of us has been influenced by journeys in our own lives that could be considered archetypal. We've watched a YouTube video about the archetypal hero's journey, and then we applied those stages as given by Campbell in his book, The Stages of a Hero, that we have also connected it to The White Castle as well by Orhan Pamuk. And then finally, we looked at and discussed the differences between a typical hero's journey and that of marginalized literature. So, as far as the works that we've looked at today that I've cited, we have discovered that we've looked at the Handbook to Literature. We've looked at an article by David Lee, the actual book, The White Castle, and then a YouTube video by Winkler and Uretsky. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen and I'll take back over. And I just wanted to thank you for your attention today as we've looked and analyzed a piece of marginalized literature using the archetypal hero's journey. Have a good one.